Thank you, everyone. And again, I remind you, we have built, this is an Ellen Hannock party. You are determined to have fun and good food. So we have built in time for socialization after this last panel. So, and thank you. I think the morning was very interesting. I really want to thank all the panelists and the moderators. They did a great job. I caught a couple themes out of this morning, and I'm hopeful we will have a discussion. We are very lucky this morning to have three seminal actors in their respective worlds, and we got Wade Crowfoot, who you all know from the last administration. I guess this goes twice to the two of you. And Wade's head Secretary of Resources. We have Karen Ross, of course, well known to all of you from Food and Ag, and we have Louise Bedsworth, who's here from the Strategic Growth Council and is a newcomer to our group. I do want to point out that long ago, she worked for PPIC, so she's good. Maybe that's in my future. In any case, the topic we were going to explore today was sort of the big picture of what next. What all three of our guests were not here, so their thoughts are not shaped by the things they heard this morning. So it's an interesting test. But I do remind you what we talked about this morning. That Ellen did a great introduction to the notion of looking at how to manage climate extremes. She mentioned Mike Dettinger, who many of you know, who has been telling us we now have to manage floods for drought, and we have to manage droughts for floods. And we need to really change our mindset in this and get to resilience in this direction. We heard also this morning, we did have the Lions and Tigers Oh My crowd, which was my favorite, of course, because it was floods, fires, and droughts. And we had that, and then we were followed by community drinking water, safe drinking water, and how to get there. So with that as background, we have the one other aspect, and that is that you are, as part of the Newsom administration, releasing your resilience portfolio, your water portfolio. And I believe, Wade, this is going to come sometime this month, probably, God willing, as you said earlier. It's government. These things take time. But everything we did this morning is related to that portfolio. Now, we're handicapped because we don't have it. We don't have it in front of us, but we pretty much know what's in it because you did a heroic job of consulting with the general public. And I have to give a shout out to Nancy Vogel, who I hope she's online. We are very fond of Nancy at PPIC because she always tells us what she thinks of us and our work. But it's an amazing effort on the part of you guys to pull that together in a document that would normally take several years to do. So congratulations to you and to Nancy for doing such a thing. But Wade, I'm going to start with the questions with you. Rather than asking you to tell us what's in the portfolio, we all can sort of think about what's in the portfolio. We had an interesting theme this morning of where we were spotting the tough lifts, the heavy lifts that are out there, the things that are likely to be difficult to do. I think it's probably more important for us to hear not the blue sky thinking of all the great things we can do, but what you as Secretary of Resources think is going to be difficult but necessary. And so I thought we'd start out with that. You have a microphone somewhere, unless you're sitting on it, I think. Whoa, that's the ultimate butt dial.
Well, listen, thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Ellen, and appreciate everyone being here. This is like always such a milestone every year to have this conference and come together and sort of take stock of the progress we've made and the work we have to come. And before I answer your question, I will say, there's a temptation when a new plan or a strategy gets delivered to focus on just that plan. But it's really critical for me on behalf of our administration to say we are building on a lot of excellent existing work and momentum. So in the Brown administration, you had the Water Action Plan 2014, the update in 2016. And really, for the first time in my experience, it actually underscored that there is no silver bullet solution on water. It's not reducible to this conflict or that. There's a broad suite of actions that the state needs to lead on. And we've taken that to heart. If you think about what's happened in the first 10 months of the administration, a lot of activity, an agreement to fund drinking water, a passage of a wetlands policy, decades in the making, resolution moving forward on CV salts, in our agency at Resources, expanding multi-benefit floodplain habitat, implementing Sigma. So I want to make sure everybody understands that this water portfolio will help understand the roadmap that the Newsom administration will take, but it's a road that we're already moving down. The other point that the governor has really stressed to us upon taking office is, to the extent humanly possible, we have to move away from these conflicts that characterize California water. North versus south, urban versus rural, agricultural producers versus environmental groups. There are reasons that those conflicts exist, and we're not naive to think that they will all of a sudden go away. But this conflict that often, materializes in litigation and debate is counterproductive to planning for the future. And so a lot of the work that some of us are doing on the voluntary agreements to help implement the Water Board's update of the water quality plan for the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers and the Delta is just that. So that's what we're building on. Back to your question. As it relates to, what is a key sort of challenge as I see within the portfolio? And I'll say institutionalizing coordination within regions to build resilience. We all know that water resilience and climate resilience needs to manifest region by region. The challenges in the southern San Joaquin Valley are very different than the North Coast. The challenges in rural Sierra Nevada counties is very different than urban Los Angeles. So we cannot have a one-size-fits-all policy across the state on climate resilience. The challenge is, what role does the state play in really driving these regional resilience efforts? And to what extent are we prescriptive towards those regional resilience efforts? And to what extent do we sit back and allow leaders in regions to lead? And so we've been in active conversation with ourselves about that. I think we clearly understand that the solutions that we need to advance in California are not necessarily coming out of Sacramento. And so I think you'll see in this water resilience portfolio us working to provide tools for regional leadership. At the same time, the state has a critical role. One, to set standards to make sure that we're actually meeting the goals that we need to as a state. Another is to drive investments or funding for those regional efforts, and another is to work on efforts that are beyond the scope of any one region. If you think about the migration corridors for salmon, that is not a challenge that can be addressed one region by region, or infrastructure modernization as it relates to our backbone infrastructure. So I'll say the biggest challenge, and I think it's been a fun challenge to take on, is the role of the state in really driving a water resilience vision that is regionally based.
Cool. So let me follow up on that. So I asked you what the toughest lift would be, but I've known you for years, and you're an inherently optimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, everybody on this stage is optimistic, which is why am I here? I know. But I want you to think now that one of the themes that came out in the earlier discussions, which I want to follow on, is 5 years from now, you and I get together here on this stage again. You have to think at least in 5-year chunks. And so this portfolio, what would you envision that in 5 years we're celebrating that comes out of this resilience portfolio in 5 years?
The California is known for its multi-benefit solutions that actually bridge environmental and human water needs. And we talk some in the executive order that the governor released. One of the principles, in fact, is prioritizing multi-benefit solutions. Mm-hmm. Increasingly, we have to prioritize these. We have to integrate them. We don't have enough money or enough time to stay in these silos. So, for example, a manifestation of that is I want to see a large increase in, for example, a multi-benefit floodplain habitat, where we are protecting downriver communities in the Central Valley in ways that provide environmental benefit for endangered salmon, in places recharge groundwater, and pay, in some cases, lease payments to agricultural producers that lease their land to be flooded. That, to me, every time I drive over the Yolo bypass, gives me optimism. It's finding those solutions that actually meet our collective needs and then driving them very hard.
Great. The multi-benefit issue, by the way, came up a lot this morning. So, Karen, let's turn to you. It's water, right? I mean, water is the throughput for the industry that you supervise, and water is always your challenge. Probably every day that you go out and look at this. One of the things that came out this morning, and I was thinking about in talking to you, is that there was there's a institutional inertia and also inertia on the part of people. We like to do things the way we've always done them. This came up, Andy Fecco, for example, was talking about headwater forest management, and we like to do things the same way. This cannot be the case for agriculture in California. It is going to have to adapt. I mean, as Ellen pointed out this morning, rising temperature, changing snowpacking, changes in seasonality, climate whiplash that we have, and sea level and its effect on water supply. So agriculture is going to have to adapt. And I'm sort of thinking about what you as a leader in this field would say when you look out over the horizon. Where and how is agriculture going to really have to change in order to meet the objectives of the portfolio and just simply respond to this changing world?
So I would say one of the hallmarks of California agriculture is it has always changed. It will continue to rapidly change, and it has been able to succeed because of its openness to change and innovation. Part of that is because of the crops that we have that are very responsive to markets, as opposed to being crops that I still grow on the farm that I own in the Midwest. That's part of it, but it's also, this state has that kind of spirit of innovation and embracing change and helping to lead change. That is no different in agriculture, and when you look at how, even in the midst of the drought, we continued to generate the kinds of revenues that we did, learned how to embrace even more water conservation, that we were really capitalizing on what we do best. And that is the opportunity before us. I am very sorry that I'm missing a presentation that I nagged my good friend, Dr. Dan Sumner, to make for a year now. I wanted him to say, what is agriculture in 2050? What are the drivers of change, and where are there reasons to rethink policy or investment? Anybody who knows Dr. Dan Sumner will be very heartened to hear that his conclusion is to be cautiously optimistic because of innovation, because he looks at Sigma, which is one of the biggest challenges ever that will have acute pain points for individuals and some communities more than others, but collectively the opportunities, looking at what Wade just talked about on multi-benefit approaches. The excitement that is in the agricultural community to think, I could be a part of recharging groundwater and pushing the envelope before we even have the best science to know how long can I leave water on grapevines and almond trees, at what temperature before I've ruined a 25-year investment because it's no longer productive. People are pushing that envelope because they know that's the only way they're going to survive. So innovation is what they're embracing. We, as policymakers, have to make sure we're giving the signals for the innovation with investment that might not be possible by individuals, but also thinking through our policy. One of the biggest reasons Dan is optimistic, as am I, and we've heard Ellen and all of you at PPIC talk about this, the policy around the ability for water transfers, the possibility for markets, which always makes me nervous, because I'm a populist from the prairie, and I want to make sure no one gets left behind, that it is very hard for a carrot grower to compete with a pistachio grower at a certain cost of water. It's very hard for a small new farmer whose first language is not English to compete with a large farmer, and it's difficult to know how to make sure disadvantaged communities, as we make progress on drinking water, are not left out of that, as well as the environment. So these are things that with thoughtful, deliberative conversations and the willingness to collaborate together, I think we can also make the right policy calls to unleash that as another tool.
So I'm hearing this note of optimism from Dan Sumner, which is, as you know, is shocking.
Yes.
I mean, that's great. That's great. No, this is good news. I thought we were the only hopeless optimists on the San Joaquin. And for those of you who have not read Ellen's report that she and her co-authors did on the San Joaquin, it is not the end of the world. And in fact, managed well, it's not so bad. It's just getting to the managing well and changing practices. But I want to come back to something. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's not just about the water, it's also the climate change, because the crops we grow here are the most susceptible to things like less chill or whatever it might be. But I also want to say this is an opportunity of a lifetime for farmers to step up front and center and identify how they can be a part of the solution to climate change, because the very land practices that have been identified as critical to food security on a global basis are practices that can sequester carbon. We can draw down carbon, which only forestry is the only other sector that has the capacity to do that on the land. And by doing that, we're building resiliency. We have better water holding capacity, both for surviving droughts as well as absorbing more water when we have those flash precipitation events. So it's also that opportunity to embrace resilience and to step up and own climate change as leaders of solutions. But we only, with harvesting, get 30 chances to try this. Yeah. That's a pretty sobering fact when you think about farming. We get a harvest a year, and we have to make that harvest every season count for the most.
It's as if you and I rehearsed that, because it leads into a follow-on question which builds off of something that we just heard from Wade, and one of our advisory council members, Lester Snow, regularly pokes us about, is are we well organized to do this? Wade kind of hinted for a second there that maybe our institutions, the institutional organization that we have, might not be well suited, and maybe we should be. So I want to give you a chance to sort of free think. The governor's not watching. The free think, because you told me he's not, because he's making a presentation somewhere else right now. Some free thinking about whether or not we're well organized and we can even accomplish this, because you just asked a farmer to do a series of public benefits, and farmers don't necessarily do that freely and easily. So are we well organized to do this?
And we as a society...
And I want to let Wade also chime in.
That'd be great.
If he feels
we
like
as a society don't necessarily connect that when a farmer is farming to the attributes that we value, whether it's for wildlife habitat or groundwater recharge or what they're doing for the good of their community, we don't necessarily, nor should we be expected to connect that, oh, they're farming for their bottom line and for the good of their community, and they're helping their employees, and I'm benefiting because they're mitigating dust. We don't think that way. We don't think in systems that way. But that's what farming is and can be more successful at. And I think our incentive programs for climate smart agriculture have already shown the enthusiasm of farmers to step up, to cost share in improving their water use efficiency, to cost share in dairy digesters, to cost share in healthy soils. And the opportunities, what we've seen in partnerships, unusual partnerships with environmental organizations and farmers, is because both are frustrated at spending a lot of money and having a lot of fights and not necessarily seeing the improvement in the environment. So they're willing to take big risks, to partner together, and they're seeing amazing results. They're starting to build that foundation of how do we bring all of the stakeholders together, how do we be patient enough to listen to one another to find new and more durable solutions.
Wade, if you want to...
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody would observe that we're a system of systems in California that's very decentralized. Some would use the word fragmented. We have 400 urban water agencies, several thousand if you count in small water systems, and those are only drinking water systems. We're not talking wastewater, flood management, et cetera. And there can be a temptation to think, oh boy, let's just imagine a different reality and blow up boxes. I'm not interested in blowing up many of those boxes because I think people in California really guard the sort of the localized nature of their institutions and the fact that they've got representation on them. So I think it would be a fool's errand to try to reimagine the structure of a system and spend all of our time and political capital on that. However, there are situations where there's a manifest failure of agencies that need to consolidate, and I think about in some drinking water cases. I will say, though, that we should really push ourselves to deepen coordination and collaboration, and I think trying to figure out how to institutionalize that. Like, it should be unacceptable that water agencies within the same watershed don't coordinate as it relates to water supply or environmental management, period. It should be unacceptable if local agencies are competing on projects that work at cross purposes. We have to figure out a way that we as a state can use our carrots or even our sticks to really drive that integration. I personally think integrated regional water management was a good 1.0 attempt at that. And then that IRWM seemed to work well in some places, and frankly, it failed in other places. So how can we learn from that? and again, figure out the right balance of the state as an influencer or a driver of that integration that is not overly controlling from Sacramento.
Yeah, okay. Louise, I want to turn to you. You've gotten to hear this, and for all of you, Louise was next door in the climate resilience, or whatever the title of it was, where their food isn't nearly as good. And Louise, you're an interloper here. People have not seen you on the stage with us, but in your role, you're focused on trying to develop resilience, climate resilience in urban and rural communities throughout California as part of the Strategic Growth Council. There's got to be some lessons that now you've heard this. You used to work on water. I mean, you paid attention to water. Some lessons you can give us when you take that high-level view from the work that you're doing right now, including with those people next door with not as good food.
Yeah, very, very nice people next door.
But they're very nice.
Yeah, actually, these probably are great conversations to try to bring together. And I will take just a moment to explain what the Strategic Growth Council is, if there are folks in the room who haven't interacted with us, because we don't engage directly in the water space. Really, we do it indirectly, I would say, through a number of our programs. The Strategic Growth Council was established just over 10 years ago through statute to bring together all of the state agencies that touch on sustainable community development in California. So as you can imagine, that is quite a few. Wade and Karen are both council members. We also have environmental protection, health and human services, transportation, business consumer services, and housing. We're chaired by the director of the Office of Planning and Research, and then we have 3 public members as well. So a council of 10. That is really our mission, is to support sustainable, resilient, thriving communities for all in California. We have a large focus on equity and how to lift up the most disadvantaged communities around the state. And so I do think, what we've been doing at the Strategic Growth Council really touches on, I think, what it sounds like has been mentioned, which is how do you try to coordinate. We're not breaking down, we're not busting boxes and blowing things up, but bringing folks together across our state partners to think about how we invest and support communities. And so through that, we've been able to develop a number of investment programs around affordable housing and transportation. We do sustainable ag land conservation investments. We also have a program called Transformative Climate Communities. And each of these programs is really built around bringing together the perspectives of all of our member agencies. But I think really the central core to what we do is it's driven and led by community vision. And I think this is seen most directly in our Transformative Climate Communities program, which is built around having a collaborative stakeholder structure in a community. We invest in a small project area, bringing together efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but to do that alongside workforce and economic development, anti-displacement of residents and businesses, climate adaptation and resiliency, and trying to fold that all together in our state's most disadvantaged communities. And so I think the other really critical piece that we do as part of our work is a lot of technical assistance and capacity building. And I think we have an excellent example. We've been partnering with the Department of Food and Agriculture on developing, working with UC Ag and Natural Resources to put community farm educators in 10 counties around California, working with farmers to understand climate smart ag programs that are available to them, so things like the Healthy Soils program, and really building some capacity in place to start to have uptake of those programs, changes in practices, accessing funding. And so I think our work is really both how do we bring folks together and talk at the state level, and then how do we marry that with what we're hearing from communities on the ground, what we're seeing as needs, and really promoting that voice to come up into our programs.
Okay, so I think I asked Wade this question, and I guess I skipped you, Karen, but I want to come bring it back to you. When we look at it, those of us in the physical sciences look at this, we're seeing a moving target. We're seeing a rapidly changing climate, where our understanding of it is always improving, but conditions are changing fairly rapidly on the ground, and this is certainly true for water and ecosystems in particular. From your perspective, though, what's the toughest, I asked Wade this, what's the toughest nut to crack? What's the hardest thing you think is that you're going to have to overcome to ultimately be successful in what your organization is trying to do? And can we learn anything from this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a number of challenges and I think a number of opportunities, but I think on the challenges, a lot of it is around capacity building and how do we build more partnerships and collaboration, and not just us as the state coming in to help, but how do we better support regionally and locally based initiatives that can build capacity in place. So I think of that as community-based organizations, local governments. I think what that collaboration looks like is going to be different in different communities around the state. But building that up in more places is going to be critical for, one, points for the state to engage, but also to really sort of bring together voices, priorities, and channel that back up. I will mention the event we're having next door, where, yes, people were commenting that your breakfast looked better than ours, but we're scrappy. So that is around engagement in climate change research. We have a research program that we have based on engagement. We require every academic applicant to our program. It is open to California-based research institutions, UCs, CSUs, and private colleges and universities in California. But we require that they all have a partnership structure to their research program, that there's meaningful engagement, and every application is scored on that. We are now requiring that some amount of funding go to a non-academic partner in every single research program we're investing in. And that is really intended to better link the research community to community action. And so that is the conversation that is happening next door today, because we've heard people want to do this and they want help and guidance and they want to learn from one another. And so that is the conversation we're having next door. And I think it is just going to be continuing to advance that work and recognize and value the local voice. That is so important. We can't just impose a solution that's going to fit the whole state. We have to amplify and hear that voice and provide channels for that to come up so that we can develop more constructive solutions.
I want to tell you, we heard that in spades this morning in both panels, and particularly in the drinking water panel. This came up again and again, partnerships, collaboration. Again, very difficult to do that in a top-down manner. It has come about. Karen, you want to?
I just want to add, I'm not sure there's enough appreciation about how overwhelmed, especially small and mid-size. I mean, all farmers feel overwhelmed right now because there's been a number of law changes. Food Safety Modernization Act, irrigated ag lands, now CV salts that a lot of farmers, just because it was a 12-year process, don't know about. Implementation of SGMA. These are huge, big impact programs, and a farmer honestly sometimes doesn't know if they're on their way to a SGMA meeting or an irrigated lands meeting or Food Safety Modernization Act meeting. And then they're going and they're sitting in the same room facing the same regulations that a 10,000 acre farmer has and a 25 acre farmer has. It's really overwhelming right now. So therefore, there's a reason to just kind of shut down and not do any other kind of engagement. I think that in disadvantaged communities, there's kind of like this loss of hope. Even if I showed up at the meeting, would it matter? And I think that having people know that showing up and actually engaging and hearing the voices around you as well as voicing yours is the best way for us to build a California for all. But that's a hard thing. We don't teach it very well, and it doesn't always happen naturally.
Wait.
Yeah, and I just acknowledge, as optimistic as we all are, that we can, look ahead and think big and think long. We're in a really challenging environment to do that. And I sense a lot of fear from stakeholder groups. I sense fear from the San Joaquin Valley, where, best case scenario, PPIC tells us that, up to 500,000 acres would get fallowed. That will impact communities that have some of the lowest per capita income in the state. So there's fear, and they're feeling squeezed. I'll say I think we all agree that bringing our groundwater supplies into sustainable yield is absolutely critical to protect agriculture for decades to come, but there's a ton of fear and tension. Likewise, on the environmental side, we're seeing the continued degradation of fish that really were hurt quite badly in the last drought. Oh, yeah. And so if you're somebody who spent your career protecting these fish, you are looking at an existential threat to these fish. From the surface water system, that is perceived by some to be the potential to make up that loss of sigma. So we're asking, stakeholders and trying to present a vision of getting away from a paradigm of conflict and everyone for themselves at the very time when the systems are really stressed. So I think that, I just observe that is a major challenge. And I do have to give the governor credit for taking this on and asking us to take on this water portfolio versus trying to just either hunker down and deal with this on a very incremental basis or de-emphasize actually taking on water. To the contrary, he said this is the time we have to lean forward.
Yes, all of us remarked this when what governor in his or her right mind takes on water in their first term, much less their second or third or fourth term. And by the way, the reference of blowing up boxes, Lester Snow, I'm not picking on him on purpose, but we all remember how that went in the Schwarzenegger administration. I want to do what we've been doing here all along as a lightning round before we go off to questions. There's going to be a lot of questions here, and I want to leave enough time for that. So 30-second answer. Enough of this pessimism. When you get up in the morning and you're looking at a job, what's the thing you're most optimistic and excited about?
Well, look, Californians do, at their best when dealing with crisis. We just saw it in the wildfires of the last couple of weeks. Yeah. We saw it in the drought. We have real challenges ahead as it relates to the climate crisis, but Californians time and again step up. And I'll have to say that in all of the public input that we received on this, for our water resilience portfolio, there wasn't a lot of it's those people's fault or it's those people's fault or go back and double down on what we've already done. I think everyone is excited for creative solutions. So we just have to figure out how the state actually steps up and holds itself accountable to lead on that.
Great.
So I would have to say innovation, obviously, but my best days are every day I get to meet with young people, and especially young people who don't come from farming, and they're excited about the golly gee whiz stuff that's happening in agriculture and the sense of purpose to help feed people, and not just feed them calories, to nourish them. At our heart, that ability for the kinds of crops that we grow that are so foundational to the best nutrition possible so every person can achieve their potential, that's what we do here, and we do it better than any place else. And when we find solutions here because of our diversity, I believe that they can be exported for application around the world. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we have to do this. We must do this, and California can help contribute to those answers.
Louise, it's all gloom and doom about climate change.
I will say for me it is when I get to go out and visit the communities and the projects that we're funding. And we spent, over the last 2 weeks, we did site visits at our 3 first-round Transformative Climate Communities investment areas, and that is Fresno, Watts, and Ontario. And these are our largest investments we've made as a council. And to go and see the partnerships that have formed in the communities, to see the projects, groundbreakings that are happening from the scale of very large housing projects to community gardens that a housing development designed, down to the length of the walking path so that they knew how far they would be walking when they came out with their neighbors in a parcel of vacant land alongside public housing and farm worker housing. So seeing those projects and seeing people doing that work is incredibly inspiring. And I think even more so, and we heard this from our partners in Fresno, some of whom are next door, of what that has meant and launched for them as a city and as a county, as they think about larger economic development goals and what they're looking toward for the future. They attribute it to that process and that partnership building and those projects. And so to me, I feel very hopeful, and I feel that everywhere I go in every part of the state. And so I think that we just need to catalyze and capitalize on that. And I encourage everyone to go out and see work that is happening in your community, because I tell our staff all the time, we can all go back and work in a windowless office for 6 weeks, for every 5 minutes that we spend out there with people. So that to me is the most inspiring.
Thank you, Louise. Okay, so what we want to do now is go to Q&A, and I want to make sure that people who haven't asked questions have the opportunity to ask questions. And as you all know, we have a microphone, and if you don't ask them, I will. And that's always it. So out there in the great netherworld, oh, come on, you got the Secretary of Resources. You've actually already asked a couple of questions. I want to give somebody else some room. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sherry Norris. I'm with the California Indian Environmental Alliance. Hi, Wade. I'm actually just making a recommendation, really, that all of the policymakers and the decision makers in the room don't be afraid to include tribes as co-managing partners and to trust the tribal decision making. Because if you really think about it, even when we talk about agriculture, the foods we eat were developed by tribes. All over, indigenous peoples all over the world, and particularly here in the Americas. And we're used to the boom and the bust of our traditional territories as far as water. And of course, now we're looking at a shorter time frame for those kinds of things. But just to encourage them actually be in the room as decision makers is in partnership.
Yeah, I'll just concur and observe that California tribes have been the stewards of these water systems for millennia. And I think there was a long period in California's history when we didn't actually have that recognition or respect. I think that has very much changed. Governor Newsom put a point on that in terms of developing a new relationship with tribes where we really have to view them as the sovereign partners that they are. I think increasingly we are trying to orient our investments, our state funding, around building capacity of tribes to be those partners. I was really gratified, for example, that our agency just provided a multi-million-dollar grant to the Yurok tribe in the Klamath River Basin, where they're going to actually do watershed management and able to do watershed management that they've been functionally doing for thousands of years. Likewise, at the Strategic Growth Council, we're actually leaning forward and really working towards actually funding work that is led by tribes. So I think it's a great observation.
We have a question down here.
Is it my turn? Thank you. So you're talking about some great projects that the council's funding that are happening in the agencies. So what kinds of things are you doing to transfer the best practices and lessons learned and to make sure that the things that didn't work in some of those failed projects aren't things that our communities keep moving forward with?
We do a lot of, especially with our Transformative Climate Communities program, which is a small number of communities. We're doing very robust evaluation. We've partnered with UCLA and really trying to share those practices and how to do that work. We also have something called the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which is actually not run by the Strategic Growth Council, but is managed by the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, which is collecting best practices and case studies and other tools to share with communities. And I think in the program, in the work at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, we heard a lot from communities that folks want someone that they can pick up and call and ask questions as they're doing this kind of work. And unfortunately, that's not something we have the resources for. And so we've worked very hard and through the program at OPR to try to build more of those tools and to try to provide more resources for learning. And I think constantly trying to think about how do we get more of that peer-to-peer learning out into the world.
Could I just add from the agricultural community? So we provide funding in addition to the project that Louise talked about, which is a new position and a new approach. We provide funding for third-party providers to do this education and to transfer this kind of information of what works and what are the best practices. Those traditionally go to cooperative extension farm advisors at the local level, resource conservation districts, and in the state we have a number of excellent resource conservation districts, but we still have gaps on the map where we could use more. And over the last few years, county farm bureaus have stepped up to also be way of convening people. And then we fund demonstration projects, which is that very traditional behavior adoption model of being the lighthouse champion. Come to my farm, we'll learn together, ask me any questions, and I'll tell you what was the real cost, what didn't work, because you're seeing this. And that's been a very traditional way of expanding the use of practices on the ground, and that's helping us to fill the pipeline with more people that are interested in, then the incentive grant for themselves to do these practices.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're doing that. And I'll just add two things that I hope show up in the final draft of the portfolio, two improvements we can make. First of all, my take is in California, we make it way too hard to do good stuff in the regions. Take, for example, wetlands restoration. Permitting wetlands restoration is the exact same process as permitting a strip mall. So while we're threatened by climate change, while our ecosystem is under unprecedented threat, and we have all of this good stuff, we in state government make it really hard and expensive and slow to get that stuff done. So one thing I'm excited about in our agency is an effort we're doing to cut the so-called green tape, to figure out how we can do good, clear, clearly beneficial projects more quickly, number one. Number two is we need to break down silos among our funding programs. Within our natural resources agency, just within the secretary's office, we have like 3 dozen funding programs. So if you want to do that multi-benefit floodplain project and you want to get flood funding and ecosystem funding and sustainable groundwater funding, there is very little likelihood that you're going to be able to access those different pots of money that have different grant criteria on different time frames, et cetera. So we need to make it easier for locals and regions to actually get these good projects done, and then we need to create somehow more fungible, flexible funding programs in partnership with the legislature, obviously, to enable more of these broad, multi-beneficial projects.
Interesting. Okay, we have a question out here.
Yeah, hi there. Given the realities of climate change, do you see a role going forward for indoor agriculture? And if so, do you see the state helping to promote that?
So definitely controlled atmosphere farming is the way the Netherlands has been such a successful agricultural contributor to global food supplies. So yes, I do. And I think there's a space for urban agriculture as much for urban greening as anything else. Indoor growing is, like everything else in agriculture, is capital intensive, but there are systems in the world. The Canadians and the Dutch are leaders in the state-of-the-art kind of technology and what's possible. I think it's been hard to see the investment flowing there in a state like California because we are blessed with so many great soils, great climates, and consistent climates, and the precipitation and the water system. But as those things change, I think you will see innovation dollars follow more investment in controlled atmosphere farming and getting through. Again, it's a permitting issue. It's got its own challenges, especially if you're wanting to add that kind of structure to coastal areas.
I'm going to interject here for a second, real quickly, before we go on to the next questions. We've been talking about, well, not all of you, but 2 of you have been talking about funding, but you haven't talked about the most important part of funding, meaning where the money comes from. Well, it does come from me. I pay my taxes happily. I pay my taxes. But I want to, are you going to address that question? I mean, we heard today some really interesting, in the earlier panels, Proposition 218 problems that people have. And, we've done a bunch of reports at PPIC on funding. I mean, Ellen has led a lot of these, and there are a series of fiscal orphans that are out there, and you've talked about some of those. So do we have a change of plan on funding that's going to, how you fund this stuff? Not doling out money, but it's the getting money.
To be candid, I don't think the solution's been found. I think we understand the problem, and we don't yet have a solution. Many in the room that are part of local water agencies heard me talk passionately about the importance of local investment in drinking water solutions. And we saw where that went, which is it moved off to a different fund source because there were strong arguments made by locals that, they're not the ones, or their ratepayers are not the ones to fund these fiscal orphans. We have a major problem moving forward with the operations and maintenance of our systems, including our environmental systems. And I don't think yet we have a resolution. There's a lot of promising leadership out of the legislature in this notion of a climate resilience bond in the next year. I think that is one potential source of funding. It's general obligation bond funding. It can only be spent on those one-time projects. So it's not necessarily the broad solution, but I think it continues to be a down payment that we can make for a future.
So you're not going to have a public goods charge on water, is what you're saying? A fee?
Well, you know, I tried that for 3 years, trying to get a drinking water solution, and you saw where that went.
Here we are.
But I will say, just to not be too challenging, but the consequence of that is, to the extent that we don't make adequate investments in our environment, our water systems for human use will continue to be impacted by our regulatory lever. Because if we can't actually invest in bringing back these systems and maintaining them, then we will find ourselves in these continuing sort of regulatory approaches, which of course water users and water agencies tend to dislike. So I would just say that it's not the get out of jail free card for local water agencies or water users if we're not funding these fiscal orphans. There is an impact, and it is more of trying to manage through suboptimal sort of regulatory approach.
Louise, you want to
I
say
mean, it's just going to respond to actually something Wade said about having 36 funding programs. And if you want to do an integrated project, this is actually a model to look to for that would be the Transformative Climate Communities program. And what that was, basically, we were hearing from communities of like, I want to do something, I want to do some urban greening, I have a housing project, need to enhance transit, and I'm going to, but I have to go to 5 different funding sources, and I have one person in my planning office, and I don't have a grant writer, And so this was one of those challenges where basically, okay, how do we actually create a program that does bring together all of these different types of California climate investment programs to a single place where they can be accessed by a community? And those other programs exist if you just want to do one thing. But for some communities, you can bring them together. And I do think that is a model. It's been a little bit of building the plane as you fly it, honestly. But we are learning, we're improving. Our first round grantees have been incredibly generous in sharing their learnings and feedback with us. And I think, in continually improving that. And we just launched the 3rd round of that program. I do think it is a model to think about how you can integrate across multiple type objective programs in a single funding stream.
That's great. Kayla, do you
have? Hey, Wade, this is Kurt. And as you know, Watershed in Yuba County, we're looking at multi-benefit projects. And there's been a lot of talk today about partnership, about collaboration, multi-benefits, and then funding. And we've got a couple of projects, for example, a fuel load reduction program in the watershed. We've started a pilot program. We want to go more landscape scale. And there's a biomass plant that needs some funding help. And so that's kind of one issue. Another one is we're looking at, operating a water system for flood protection for water supply. And we've got partners in it in terms of the federal government contributing millions of dollars, local governments contributing millions of dollars. Support is needed on research on atmospheric rivers and forecast-informed reservoir operations. Are those the types of programs that you see the state can help fund with the cost share that the other partners are bringing in?
Yeah, on the first point, we definitely need to strengthen the connection between water and our forests. And Yuba's a leader on that, as is Placer County, actually making investments in watershed protection. Obviously, the water agency should not be the only funder. The state's spending $1 billion over the next 5 years managing forests, in large part to reduce catastrophic wildfires. And so what we're focused on is really adding the layer in for water management, supply and quality, and ensuring that we're prioritizing projects that are not only improving the health of our forests and protecting communities, but also protecting water systems. So we have to figure out a way to spend more of our forest dollars in ways that help watersheds like yours. On atmospheric rivers and forecast-informed reservoirs, what I'd ask is, and there's some really good energy at the regional and local level, but I'm not yet clear on the connection between the work that the Army Corps has done over the last 10 years, the work that the Department of Water Resources has done, and this regional effort. And we have to create a coherent roadmap. I mean, the challenge with changing the flood curve on a reservoir is it takes like a decade. And we really need a lot of basic research to start that, but then we need to connect the dots. And so I would be a supporter of the state funding forecast-informed reservoir operations and but we need to make the connection around, okay, how is it actually going to result in changed management? At what reservoirs? How many? How long? Because what I don't want to do is have the state spend its precious resources on research that's not fully integrated or optimized what the Army Corps or DWR is doing.
We have a question here.
Yes, what I hear is something that leans towards a collaborative situational awareness, increasing collaborative situational awareness. And is there a metric? Is there a meaningful metric that could be used at state level, regional level, local levels that people could see that shows their collaboration efforts?
I'll just say in the interest of being candid, one of the things we talked about as an interagency working group is there sort of a resilience dashboard, a water resilience dashboard that we could hold each region accountable for. And I think what you'll see in the draft portfolio for public review is at least an assessment regionally of what of the relative sort of vulnerabilities by region. I think two challenges with the regional dashboard. One is how do you build something that is actually of sort of that is one dashboard for places that are facing such different threats? And secondly is what do you do with that dashboard? Do you use it to condition funding? If you do, how do you define those regions? Do you use the IRWM basins? Do you use the water board districts, et cetera? So I'm a little hesitant to, again, spend 2 or 3 years on a new sort of command and control as it relates to investment based on some one-size-fits-all dashboard. But I think we want to create space in the water resilience portfolio to have that discussion. Because I think if I had a magic wand, we would condition most of the state funding that we have to, is the region unified, whether it's a watershed or a broader region, and is what they're asking for priorities, and can we make the link between building their resilience and the project?
Good answer. We have a question out here.
First of all, thank you for a very fast-paced and thoughtful discussion. I really enjoyed this. I'm a farmer, so there's part of me that's going to be pessimistic. But I'm also an organic farmer, so I have to be optimistic. I need your help. So from all of you, hopefully you could help me on this. What's the story farmers need to tell the public, specifically city folks, environmentalists, to build cooperation and collaboration?
That's in your lap, Karen.
Oh, no, well, so we're talking to a renowned author.
Yes.
This is really not fair.
That's right.
Matsumoto is not just a regular farmer. He writes beautiful stories. And I think, Mas, it's this willingness to step out and tell a personal story that resonates with the person. You do it best. If you haven't read Epitaph for a Peach, you're missing something. I made all my girlfriends, they were savoring peaches when I finished reading his first 3 pages. So it's that ability to step in and talk about, on my farm with my family, this is what I grow, and I have a picture of you and your family enjoying it around the table, but I take great pride. Agriculture is the original steward, and they take great pride in that. We already have a culture of stewardship, but I fear that too many times what our city folk, friends, voters, consumers hear is complaints about environmental regulation without understanding how much time is spent on a farm to think about how do I leave this better for the next generation. It reminds me of what I admire so much about our Indian tribes that only think about we're borrowing this land from the future generations. They don't even think about it as mine to pass on. I love that culture, and farmers have that kind of a culture, and it's important to not shy away from that and to talk about what I'm doing on climate change, to also give you a delicious, juicy peach. So if you're not a subscriber, I'm just saying, Mas, how's that for a help?
That's right. It's a nice pitch. We have a question over here.
Yes, Frank Ramirez, National American Indian Veterans. A question for Wade, but actually all 3 of you. How do we educate the general public on what we're looking at with climate change? the climate change having tree mortality, the wildfires impacting the watershed, the impact on the ocean. 90% of the kelp forests have died since 2015. The impact of climate change on the protein value of rice, egg. How do we do, recommendations, how can we get a message to the general public so they understand the seriousness of what we're looking at?
Yeah,
This is going to be our last question.
I'll just say pretty briefly, first of all, I think we're blessed in California because I think Californians get it. And if you look at PPIC's polling year after year, Californians understand that human-induced climate change is real, and they understand that they're experiencing the impacts right now. And I think if there's any silver lining on some of the natural climate-driven disasters that we've had as recently as a couple of weeks ago, it's that people are connecting the dots. So I am very thankful. I mean, we have a legislature that is leaning forward on this. We have a governor that's leaning forward on this. And that's largely because our constituents want us to lean forward on this. I do think, though, we have to tell the story more. And to Karen's point, it's how the climate change is going to impact the family farmer. The kelp, we have this amazing redwood forest, something like a redwood forest that runs from Monterey to the Oregon border. And it is the foundation of our ecosystems in the ocean. And it is largely wiped out. It is if you took redwood forests across California and introduced an invasive species and lost the redwoods within 10 years. If you go down in scuba and anywhere north of San Francisco, you will see urchin barrens. And that results from an invasive purple urchin that was in part driven into the coast as a result of changing climate temperatures and acidity. So not a lot of people know that. Point being, we need to continue to drive home the need for Californians to be leaders, not only on reducing emissions, that's important, but protecting our people and nature from the impacts that we'll continue to experience.
And I just want to add that I've taken a number of delegations on what we call climate smart ag missions. Ellen was on one with us. And the thing that always strikes the farmers in the group when we come back home is that it is a political topic here, and it's not politicized other places. It's a fact of life that they're managing through. So it's great that California's leading, and we should, but we have to find ways to help people across this country stop seeing it as a political issue. And they're beginning to, if you just look at insurance payouts for the continued weather disasters just last year alone. So people are talking about change. They just don't want to say the words climate and change or get into what are the causes. Change is happening. What are we doing about it? And please share the sense of urgency.
Louise, you get the last word.
I was going to say, I think you put it into a language or experience that people know, and I think that is really important. Actually, I think it goes back to work I did with Ellen at PPIC when we were looking at communities that were addressing climate change, and we actually would look at the surprises and why. And it's because they made it a topic they could identify with. Maybe they didn't use the term climate change, make it more local. I think that's really important. And then I would also encourage, if folks have not read, there was an opinion piece in the New York Times by Catherine Hayhoe just the other day, who's a climate scientist. And she was talking about why when people ask her if she believes in climate change, she says no. Because science is fact, it's not something you believe in. It is actually a fact. And it's an excellent piece, and she really goes through, how do you talk about this? And she is an incredible advocate in this space, really coming from actually a deeply religious perspective as well. And so I think that's really important, is how do we shift the conversation and bring it into a language and a context that people relate to?
Okay, I would like us to thank our panel. They were awesome. So with that, let me hand this off to Ellen, who will wrap it up. Oh, you have it.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So I also want to thank all of our wonderful speakers and moderators, and all of you for being so present and for asking really good questions and raising good points. And so the next part of the program is going to be the informal part, where we want you to stay around for a tasty lunch and mingle, and you can, you don't have to sit with the same people even. You could move to another table maybe, or at least. I want to also thank our annual sponsors who made this possible for us to do this. And I want to thank the incredible PPIC colleagues who have made this all look so seamless. Some of them have been walking around with mics or checking you in, and Kelly, I'm looking at you, and Teresa, and Carlos, there he is, and many others. So please join me in thanking them. And then if you have any questions about PPIC or want to find out how to contribute to future events, don't hesitate to find one of us and sign up if you're not already getting our publications. We don't spam people too often. And answer your survey when you get it later in your inbox today. Thank you so much.